So, last time I talked about the facilitation of Act 1, Scene 7 before they were killing Duncan, Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, and the plans to go ahead with it. So, now I'm going to talk about what we did in the next couple of lessons, how we sort of segued into Act 2, Scene 2, and some of how Act 2, Scene 2 worked. So, or how we're devising it to work. So, in the segue, we had a couple of lessons sort of thinking about how we might show this. I think we might have dwelled on it a bit too much because it's better to be simple, and that's what we decided in the end. We started off with talking about the idea of the transition, including Duncan's death, and including how Act 2, Scene 2 is going to work, because we wanted it to provide a good contrast between the Act 1 Scene 7 and Act 2 Scene 2. In this decision, first I'll talk about Duncan's death. So we talk about, we're going to go on to Act 2 Scene 2, which is a good example of how Macbeth changes. And then we might have we had one of the pretend students saying, what scene is that? Originally, we thought about the idea of using one of the cast to, with a pretend knife or with no knife, saying, "Is this a dagger I see before me?" and a dagger, and then stabbing somebody else to show the Duncan killing, whilst another student was saying, that's when Duncan dies, obviously, when they kill him, because this is the lead up to that moment. The Year 11s will already know this. It's quite a major plot point, and it's not really need to be investigated that much in terms of their character development, the actual logistics of the killing, but it's good to just have it in there to sort of provide the context of where the two scenes are going to be placed on either side of this main event. So we thought about that. But this changed in the next rehearsal, as we were directed by Starbuck to actually depict the killing, and just having the stab with two guards who have been spiked with their drinks, and then they obviously pass out, and then that leaves Macbeth free to kill Duncan. But this was changed again, I think, either by the cast decision or by Chip, because it just seemed like we were dwelling too much on things that weren't relevant to Macbeth's plot point. The whole point of these two scenes were to describe what had happened before and after. And so in all of Lady Macbeth, what she says, and all of Macbeth, what he says in the next scene, provides context for what actually happened, and then it leaves more up to interpretation for the actual students rather than us actually showing it. It limits their interpretation because they might just remember what emotion the actor was showing when he was doing it. So I think it was better when it was simpler, and it was just an easy segue into the next section, which we could focus more on, because the actual, as I said before, the actual killing isn't that important in Macbeth's character development, the logistics of it. I mean, the killing is what triggers him, you could say, because we talk about how, as an ambitious person, he gets thirst for it, but the actual thing isn't that important. So we wanted to transfer into that. Then talking about how, so we decided to go back to our original idea. Then talking about how Act 2 Scene 2 was going to work, we decided on doing it in modern English, and this was a kind of a big decision, and it provided a really good contrast. It did this, and it enabled the audience and the Year 11s, because they probably read this scene before, it shows it in a different way. It allows them to have a deeper understanding of what it actually consists of, what the words are, the meaning's more obvious behind it, and even though they might have studied it at great lengths, it's different to sort of watching it to like just reading it on the page. And if you can visually show one in the Shakespearean text and one in the modern day English, they might be able to make assumptions or connections between the two, and then break down the types of language, and that's what we're aiming for anyway. So in terms of that, we have the idea of three potential quotes in the groups that they were in before, with each fake student, so the three sections, and each of them being allocated a certain quote with a big special quote at the end, which will be like a bonus for them to sort of figure out. we could have the 3 different groups focusing on each of those quotes and picking it out from the actual scene, picking out that moment and seeing if they can pick the translation and whether it sort of helps them unpick the actual quote itself so they can really descriptively write about it in their exam. So that's with the intentions of that. So also in the segue, we've got the idea of like saying, can we do it in modern English now instead, to sort of help the fake students and their understanding, which would hopefully be more beneficial. So we actually looked at we started to look at the breaking down of Act 2, Scene 2, and as a class we broke down the translation, we translated it ourselves. I think this was good because it helped us understand what the actual quotes were and breaking down the language ourselves, so that we could know basically, so we could be able to talk about it to them and we have an understanding rather than just like being like blank facilitators in terms of like the action that's going on. So I think it was good in terms of helping our understanding to have more knowledge about what we were actually talking about. So we broke it down into really simplistic English, but in order to make sure that we weren't missing any bits out or elements that definitely showed off Macbeth's and Lady Macbeth's changing relationship, which we feel definitely has changed. It allows the audience as well, particularly in this scene, Lady Macbeth's control over Macbeth, and whether the audience might interpret that it was his ambition that sent him this way, or whether it was more to do with Lady Macbeth's influence. And we had this sort of idea of potentially facilitating this, talking to the audience about whether they thought that or not, because as we've figured out, we need to condense more what we're doing onto a particular key point. So we are focusing on the development and the change of character of Macbeth mainly, but that does tie in with the other characters such as Lady Macbeth, such as the witches, who all have influence onto Macbeth. So that was a really important key aspect that we wanted to include, and we could include by introducing Act 2, Scene 2. At this point as well, we also talked about how we would talk more deeply into explaining exactly what's happening. So the idea of like clarity, and it gives like more of an impression of what the scene would actually feel like. And we could sort of talk a bit about that and try and facilitate that before the actual scene starts. We also found, and this is just from a point of view of experience of TIE that I am like now understanding, is that the best way to facilitate and contrast the 2 scenes was like via class discussion. So the discussion sort of will help hopefully like solidify the knowledge and solidify the understanding, because then as well, if they don't understand something or why we did something, we can explain it to them better, and if people are nervous to sort of get involved, then this might help as well. We also included looking at exam criteria in terms of like technique, in terms of what to use in their exam, link to revision style and things like that. So in terms of what they actually need to include, it was really important, because this was like we'd finished both the scenes. We wanted to add it somewhere in between there about like the exam criteria and how good quotes can be to use in your actual exam. So we have that sort of aspect added in there as well, which was quite important in the brief that we were given. So yeah, that was more or less what we did. We're almost finished the Act 2, Scene 2. We've not directed it mainly because that's what Chip was going to do with the actual 2, but we translated it all, and we looked at how this will fit in with the rest of the performance. Not sure what we are going to do to help build on this, what we have so far, but we might add in some elements of influence from Lady Macbeth or the witches. We might talk about the contrasting people to Macbeth, and why he in particular chose like the tragic path, and is that what led to his tragic downfall.